Ich bitte Ruhe im Saal.
Please be quiet.
Kongressleitung Alexia Stueva
I would like to
und
ask
Sandra
the
Pelzmann
chair,
bitten, die
Alexei
Sitzung zu
Stuifer and
eröffnen.
Sandra Pelzmann, to take their seats.
Ich erkläre die Auftaktsitzung des zweiten Wochenendes der Wiener Kongresse hiermit
I hereby call the opening session of the second weekend of the Vienna Congresses to order. First of all,
darf ich die Mitwirkenden dieses
I
Wiener
would like to
Kongresses
introduce all of those
links
contributing
außen
to this Vienna
die
Congress. On
Assistenz
the
der
left,
Kongressleitung Sabine Boissy
Sabine
aus
Bouissy
dem Rat der
from
Republik,
the Council
neben
of
ihr
the Republic, assistants
der
to
Kongressschreiber
the chair next to
des
her.
Wochenendes
This
Stefan Weiß,
is
Ressortleiter der
Stefan
Standard.
Weiss, who is the head of the Standard Culture Department on my right.
Sandra Pelzmann,
My deputy chair,
an der Universität
Sandra
Wien
Pelzmann,
und
who
Künstlerin,
is a
Clownin.
teacher at the University of Vienna. The simultaneous interpretation of everything that is spoken today into English will be done by Jill Kreuer and Claudia Fischer-Balja.
Des zweiten Kongresses
The
setzt sich
jury
wie folgt zusammen.
of the second Congress is made up as follows.
Kuratorin
Fariba Mosley is a curator and cultural manager and currently co-director of Brunnenpassage Vienna. She studied cultural anthropology, sinology, cultural management, and universities in Vienna, Guangzhou, and Barcelona.
kuratiert Projekte
She curates projects with transcultural, cross-gender, and co-creative anti-discriminatory artistic practice with a focus on performance and visual arts.
Stein, Kolumnist,
Harald Martenstein is a journalist and columnist. Unfortunately, he was not able to be here because of illness. We're very happy to have one, Robert Abfarda, as a member of the jury. He studied philosophy in Vienna and Berlin, and he's a professor for philosophy at the Art University of Linz. In 2009, from 2009 to 2014, he was a professor of philosophy at the University for Applied Arts in Vienna. He is the author of a number of philosophical works. In 2022, he was awarded the Paul-Watzlawick Award. Svenja Flaspöhler is a philosopher, author, and journalist. She writes on social, political, and cultural issues, and she is the editor-in-chief of the Philosophie magazine. Her work focuses on questions of freedom, identity, and feminism.
Sophia Süßmilch lebt als
Sophia Süßmilch is a Bavarian from Berlin with an Austrian background. She was born as a German citizen in the last millennium, and
eigener Aussage nach in diesem
as she would put it, she will die in this one.
Bildhauerei sowie
She studied
Malerei
sculpture and painting in Munich and Vienna. Süßmilch
und Genre
works in multimedia and across genres. She has been awarded numerous scholarships and prizes.
bereitet.
Thank you very much to all of you for agreeing to be a part of this Congress.
Darf ich Sie
Ms. Deputy Chair, may I ask you to take the floor? Thank you very much. Alexia Stuefa is our chair for this weekend. She's a lawyer and a criminal defense lawyer. She's an author and external lecturer for the Faculty of Law at the University of Vienna.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much.
Stellvertretung.
To my deputy chair, before we begin, I would like to ask Milo Rau to give his opening statement. Milo Rau is an author, a director, and since 2024 he has been the artistic director of the Vienna Festival. He's also a member of the Free Republic of Vienna and a co-signatory of the Vienna Declaration. Thank you very much. Mr. Rau, you have 8 minutes. Thank you very much.
Untersuchungsleiterin, liebe Jury,
Chair, co-chair, jury, members of the Council of the Republic, audience.
dieser
The
Festwochen
motto of this festival is V is for love. This is a motto that you can see on hundreds of posters scattered throughout the city. One poster shows a pair of sisters, another shows a couple that is presumably homosexual, and another shows a pregnant woman. Some of these people are members of the Council of the Republic and will be sitting here on the stage over the next several days. And all of the models have a V carved into their foreheads.
ausgehängt wurden, bekamen wir
When the posters were put up in April, we received many angry emails. What does this V mean? Why is it carved into the foreheads? Are the people on the posters members in a cult? Is it an intentional reference to Charles Manson, who had famously carved a swastika into his forehead? What is this supposed to be? A republic of love in the age of Me Too. Others chose not to write us mails, but instead they tore the posters off the walls and they set them on fire, as you've probably read. In many places, the pregnant woman's stomach was cut out. One association even organized a campaign against what they called, quote, offensive imagery. This is the territory we will be exploring over the next 3 days. Where does aesthetic transgression become an affront to the feelings of others? Where does radical art become traumatic? Where does art end and where does reality begin? Crossing boundaries, self-harm and harm to others, nudity, submission and liberation parties and horror, disrespectfully toying with symbols, generating a solidarity amongst the incompatible. These are the currency of radical art. In the next 3 days, we will examine cases that are highly complex and also very different. Otto Mühl, Rammstein, and Teichtmeister. We will hardly take an interest in the actual or alleged perpetrators themselves. The verdicts have been handed down, and in any case, we're not holding trials here, but rather congresses. In the next coming days, rather, we will be concerned with the systems, the institutions, or to put it more simply, the art market in which these people operate or operated. It's about what happens to all of us when, according to the program of the Republic of Love, when the personal becomes political, when edginess becomes a method, and when history and bodies of those involved become aesthetic material. This also raises a very simple question. Who actually decides what and who is declared art? And who decides where art ends and where true untouchable intimacy begins? What are we doing here at the Vienna Congresses? For example, when we bring victims of the Mühl Commune and the Rammstein system onto the stage in a setting where tickets are sold. Are we helping to clarify the issue? Or does such a Congress not, in fact, subject us to what Bourdieu called the rules of art, the brutal, ruthless rule of an art market in which everything quite simply becomes a commodity to be bought and sold? But it's even more complicated than that. I'm not just standing here as a director, but also as an artistic director of one of the 2 largest crossover festivals in Europe. I invite productions to the Republic of Love because they expand the field of art, because they're radical. I love the work of Caroline Bianchi, Chokri Benchica, Valentina Holzinger, and Markus Oehlen, because these artists not only take risks in their work, but also take risks with their teams and us, the audience. But what does curatorial power mean in this context? How do I create a framework in which radicalism is possible, but no real harm is done? In which the V carved into people's foreheads is only superficial. It's a game, a symbol, and no one is left with a permanent scar. The questions we will be facing in the coming days present us with contradictions. Does it help a feminist film if it is banned because it features a pedophile? Should the photographer of a poster campaign be advised not to work with naked people, as the Press Council recommends? How do you deal with a band that has been acquitted in court, but only because of lack of evidence? What moral code do we follow? With all of these codes of conduct, even the Republic of Love is revising its own in recent weeks. Is it perhaps less about protecting people than about protecting institutions that find themselves under attack from all sides? When does a Republic of Love become an authoritarian sect? When does the portrayal of crime become an actual crime? When does the cult of genius become abuse? When does transgressive collaboration become exploitation? And who decides when this line has been crossed? Yesterday, a journalist asked me, wasn't it cynical to grapple publicly with cases such as Rammstein, Teichtmeister, Otto Mühl within the framework of a Republic of Love? He asked wasn't it absurd to carve a V into your forehead and at the same time debate mindfulness? I really couldn't think of an answer, but together with you, I want to ask myself in the next coming days how this might work. How to develop a radicalism that is uninhibited as it is careful, as disrespectful as it is tender, a solidarity-based artistic practice amid all of the contradictions of our world and ourselves. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Milo Rau.
Thank you very much, Milo Rau. Please take your seat.
Svenja
I
Flasspöhler.
would like to ask jury member Svenja Flasspöhler to give us her introduction to this weekend.
Verehrtes Publikum, das Wort Missbrauch meint einen Gebrauch von Gegenständen,
Audience,
Substanzen
I
oder
would like to talk about the word abuse. It refers to the use of objects, substances, or living beings that runs counter to the prevailing notions of custom, morality, and law. It is immediately apparent that the term has an inherent historicity. What does this mean? It means that the meaning of the term has evolved over time. What we view as abuse and what exactly we understand by it has much more to do with the respective zeitgeist, with norms and customs and valid law, with emancipation efforts of marginalized groups and the concomitant degree of social awareness. Until 1997, men in Germany and Austria could force their wives to engage in sexual intercourse without punishment. In the anti-bourgeois milieus of the 1970s, this includes, for example, Otto Mühl and the Viennese actionism, sexual acts with children were seen as having educational value. Bosses who encroached on their female employees' personal space with undisguised intentions and exploited their positions of power were either tolerated or admired for their virility. Rock stars such as Jimi Hendrix or Keith Richards were also idealized, even though or precisely because they partied excessively after the show and slept with their female fans. Successful visual artists who let themselves be passionately kissed by their muse, as they say, for their creative power also escaped all criticism. Pablo Picasso had just died when Otto Mühl founded his commune in Burgenland. A girl by the name of Marie-Thérèse Walter was one of Picasso's most important nude models. She was 17 years old when he approached her on the street in Paris. 40 years old at the time, Picasso was already a celebrated painter. Marie-Thérèse followed him to his studio. In 1935, she had a child with him. That same year, Picasso met Dora Maar, his next muse, whom he would leave for François Gillot in the early 1940s. Today, we live in a different world. What was celebrated just a few decades ago as an expression of liberated sexuality, read as artistic potency or tolerated as male privilege, is now considered sexualized violence and or an expression of toxic masculinity. The awareness of power imbalances, dependencies, and male privilege has intensified and become enormously refined in the recent past. The key driver of this development has been the globally influential Me Too movement, which began in the arts. In 2017, several women accused film producer Harvey Weinstein of sexual harassment, coercion, and rape. Shortly afterwards, actress Alyssa Milano called on women on Twitter to take part in the Me Too movement. If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too in the response to this tweet. Milano wrote. This set off a wave. Women around the world shared their experiences of abuse, ranging from rape and coercion to unpleasant touching, stares, and insults. The effects of this movement hit and affected the art sector in particular. To name just 3 examples from 2018, Kevin Spacey was subsequently cut out of Ridley Scott's All the Money in the World due to allegations of abuse that proved to be untenable. Netflix ended its collaboration with Spacey and sued the actor for damages. A planned exhibition of works by artist Chuck Close at the National Gallery of Art in Washington was canceled due to alleged verbal harassment. A planned exhibition by fashion photographer Bruce Weber at the Deichtorhallen in Hamburg was canceled due to allegations of sexual harassment. At this point, the first questions arise that we will grapple with in more detail over the next several days. Are we not simply dealing with emancipatory progressiveness in the case of Me Too and the resulting dynamic, which justifiably defends itself against abuse legitimized by the patriarchy? But rather, are we focusing on a questionable form of counterattack, which, fueled by revenge, often catches the wrong people in the dragnet? Are the many spontaneous cancellations ultimately nothing more than cancel culture? Have artists been prejudged and are therefore also victims of institutional cowardice? Have museums, galleries, and production companies unfairly kowtowed to public pressure?
Dies wäre
Or, and this would be the feminist Me Too view, do such critical questions reveal an unfair bias in favor of the perpetrator?
aus MeToo-Perspektive gerade begrüßenswert, wenn Institutionen sich Zweifeln öffnen.
It is important for institutions to open themselves, as opposed to focusing on monetary interest and protecting artists.
Ein eingestelltes Strafverfahren ist noch kein Unschuldsbeweis.
Of course, just because a case has been dismissed, this is not proof of guilt, but rather that guilt could not be proven.
Nur weil man noch keinen
Just because you haven't seen a black swan doesn't mean that black swans don't exist.
So ein weiteres MeToo-Argument.
There's another Me Too argument. Of course, the revolution calls for its victims. Of course, this may end up affecting the wrong person. This is, as some people say, this is the price of progress. Of course, this entails another set of problems. What about the law? The question of whether and to what extent changes to the law could better protect women and other groups of people at risk of violence. In addition to the radical demand to abolish the presumption of innocence altogether and to believe the victim without reservation, more moderate approaches are primarily aimed at countering the phenomenon of paralysis of fear more effectively in legal terms. People often experience a psychological blockade in threatening situations, which is why they do not defend themselves and allow the act of violence to happen to them against their will. In Germany, as in many other countries, the criminal law on sexual offenses has therefore been tightened. The law was tightened in 2016, making not only tangible violence against a person, but also the disregard of their will a punishable offense. Critics of such tightening argue that the phenomenon of fear paralysis was already covered by the old law. This law was simply not applied consistently. In addition, the tightening of the law poses very practical problems because you first must prove that the alleged perpetrator disregarded the will of the alleged victim. In connection with this, the critics point to the sobering results. Violence against women has not actually decreased as a result of this tightening of the sexual criminal law in Germany. This raises the question of whether an increasing legalization of the sexual sphere is no longer the solution after a certain point. Are we as a society placing too much hope in the law? Are we even headed toward a new prudery? Or are these fears that have always been voiced as soon as oppressed groups were able to assert their rights more confidently? These are questions that will certainly be at the back of our minds over the next several days. Another sensitive issue that has caused a heated debate is the expansion of the concept of violence and victimization that has taken place in recent years. The term sexualized violence is similarly unspecific to the term abuse and covers everything from rape to verbal harassment. Critics of this development argue that it blurs the definition of what constitutes violence. In this way, serious acts of violence are trivialized and easily overlooked. In fact, the Me Too movement has shown remarkably little interest in domestic violence, even though this is where most sexual offenses take place, in the home. The other side, on the other hand, argues that looks and words also hurt and are still an expression of powerful patriarchal structures. Moreover, it is possible to walk and chew gum at the same time. In other words, to combat both rape and catcalling at the same time. The expansion of the concept of violence and victimization is accompanied by the major controversial issue of exactly where the boundary between power and coercion lies. Power means there is an imbalance of power, there are relationships of dependency, there are structures that disadvantage certain groups and favor others. The concept of coercion is stronger. If there is coercion, a person has no agency.
einer Situation.
They are at the mercy of the situation at hand.
Fälle sind sehr
Some cases are very clear. A child who is abused by an adult is very clearly the victim of coercion.
Frau, die von
And a woman who is raped by a man is not only exposed to a power imbalance that she can, in principle, escape, she is forced against her will. She has no possibility of deciding against the act.
ist eine Frau,
Conversely, a woman who is flirted with by a superior, she is indeed exposed to a power structure, but not to coercion.
zwingt sie im
Nothing strictly forces her to respond to the advances of her superior and climb into bed with him.
Gleichwohl
Nevertheless, her autonomy is challenged by this power imbalance. It is made more difficult for her to decide freely and express her autonomy, because this may entail professional disadvantages.
oszillierender
On the other hand, the boundary becomes even more blurry when power structures restrict
Entscheidung
one's own scope for decision-making to such an extent that they come very close to coercion. The Rammstein case appears to be just such an example, and we will take a closer look at this on Sunday. In conclusion, the debate is whether the immense change in perception that we have seen in the recent years is an unmistakable sign of progress,
ob
or
mehr
whether it has more or less subliminal totalitarian traits.
ist Männlichkeit
Is masculinity toxic per se, or does feminism overshoot the mark with blanket condemnations? You have 1 more minute. That's perfect, thank you. Is it progressive or regressive to ban works of art from public view whose creators have engaged in wrongdoing, either legally or only morally?
Was für eine Gesellschaft wollen wir leben?
What kind of society do you want to live in? Up to what point and how exactly should art make space for amorality? Where and when exactly does it become problematic? These are complex and delicate questions. I am curious to see what answers we will find. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Svenja Flasker.
Thank you very much, Svenja Flasperla.
Ich übergebe damit das Wort
Now I would like to give the floor to my deputy, who's going to make a couple of organizational remarks. Thank you very much. Now, in addition to today's opening session, 3 further sessions will be held during this extended weekend. This is not a trial, mind you, but rather a Congress. And the Congress wants to reach the task of addressing fundamental questions. And we're going to attempt to get to the bottom of them. We're going to discuss 3 cases. And like every investigation, the Vienna Congress requires rules of procedure. Therefore, we would like to ask all participants to comply with them. The Congress hereby adopts the following rules of procedure. The Free Republic of Vienna has appointed us, the Congress, in other words, the participants, the jury, and also the Council of the Republic in order to gain some insights into fundamental issues, the so-called key questions, on the basis of 3 specific cases that we will hear. The Congress follows a 2-stage procedure. The sessions will begin with a brief introduction of the respondents, who are then questioned, interviewed by the Congress Director and the jury. The following principles constitutes the guiding principles of the Congress: the principle of publicity, the principle of orality, the principle of immediacy, the principle of being heard, and the principle of equal speaking time. At the end of the interviews, the jury will vote on the key questions in a consultation process on Monday after a summary is given by each jury member. And the head of the Congress and I, her deputy, will attend the deliberations, and the jury will then announce its decision by a simple majority of the votes, and any opposing opinions can be expressed by the members of the jury in a personal statement. Recommendations will be given by the jury And the Council of the Republic will make decisions within the context of, let us say, more general issues and also in relation to Wiener Festwochen and the Free Republic itself. The following questions constitute the basis for the vote of the Council of the Republic at the end of the Congress. So, basic question to the Council of the Republic. Question number 1. Is the international Me Too movement a restriction of artistic freedom? Yes, no, abstention. Second, when curating and establishing the program of Wiener Festwochen, must the work as such be considered, judged, and also categorized separately from its producers? Once again, yes, no, or abstain. 3. Can art that is created in, let us say, violent and or abusive context be shown at the Vienna Festival, Wiener Festwochen, with an appropriate contextualization? Once again, yes, no, or abstention. The representatives of the Council of the Republic will decide on these fundamental questions at the end of the Congress by vote, which is to say by show of hands. The Second Vienna Congress is entitled Art and Abuse, and it is dedicated to the legal, ethical, and political examination and review of artistic work created in the context of structural or individual violence or abuse of power. The focus will be on fundamental questions regarding the separability of a work and an author, as well as the legal responsibility of individuals and institutions in the context of such incidents. From a legal perspective, tensions between, let us say, constitutionally protected artistic freedom, for example, Article 17a of the Basic Code, in conjunction with Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights and the protection of personal rights and victim protection, will be discussed. The latter is expressed in criminal procedural law in particular. Pursuant to Section 66 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, victims are entitled to comprehensive rights, including the right to information, to protection of their privacy, to psychosocial and also legal support during a trial, and also to participation in the proceedings. The application of these rights is also relevant in a cultural context. For example, when victims are confronted with their former perpetrators, or also institutions in which assaults were systematically concealed or ignored as part of a process. And the further area we're going to deal with is the legal basis of reporting of suspicious activities, especially in the area of a conflict between public interests, personal rights. This is laid down in Section 1330 of the Civil Code, the Austrian Civil Code, that is, and also due diligence obligation under media law. Similarly, we're going to deal with questions of civil and criminal liability in connection with affidavits, the legal assessment of previous crimes, and also how to deal with current allegations. Now, the aim of this Congress is to critically analyze the existing normative framework and also to examine the legal feasibility and manageability of power relations and institutional complicity in the arts and in the field of culture. Both abstract questions of principle and also concrete specific case constellations will be addressed in order to reveal structural patterns and systematic omissions. So, approach all of this, as already explained, 3 cases will be dealt with during this weekend, after a brief introduction into the topic, in each case on the basis of interviews. And these interviews with the respondents will proceed as follows. First of all, in the first 10 minutes, the Congress management will outline the case and point out the key questions to be answered. 2, the interview of the respondents will follow The interviews are conducted by the Congress management and the jury. It will last 20 minutes. 5 minutes will clarify basic questions as to name, etc. And for the following 15 minutes are left for questions to be asked by the jury. 5. Later on, the Council of the Republic will have the opportunity to ask questions. And 6. At the end of the interview, one jury member will summarize the statements made. As you can see, the Congress program is quite extensive, which is why it is very important to us to adhere to the time limits, and therefore we're going to call your attention to this. We ask for mutual respect. In case of any violation of verbal attacks, we're going to intervene. We would also like to ask you to refrain from applause or any expressions of dislike. Should these nevertheless occur, we will call the meeting to order, and if necessary, the audience will have to leave the room. Also, I would like to point out that any description of psychological and sexualized violence will be described during the Congress, which is to say, both for our audience watching us via the live stream and also the audience here, please regard this as a trigger warning. Now, the following contributions serve as an introduction to the central lines of conflict and fundamental questions that will define the framework of the 3 days. The focus is on the debate surrounding violence and abuse in the world of art, also the classification of social emancipation movements, as well as criticism of the Me Too movement, and also the accusation of excessive influence on artistic freedom through demands for so-called political correctness. In addition, questions of power criticism, critique even, and the need for structural change in the field of culture and art will be addressed. In their remarks, the speakers will highlight key points of conflict that will be subject of in-depth investigations and discussions over the course of the next 3 days. Among other things, the Me Too movement will be discussed as a significant social turning point that has contributed significantly to openly addressing abuse of power and structural violence in art and culture. The controversies surrounding the question of whether and to what extent a work and an author can be separated from each other have been addressed in the world of art, and they point to fundamental structural tensions, and they can only be adequately addressed and understood through a detailed critical review. Well, thank you very much to my deputy. Now, I would like to ask Markus Oehn to make his first contribution. Markus, the floor is yours. Markus Oehn is a theater maker and also a visual artist. And in his performances, he deals intensively with structural, familial, and also patriarchal violence. Works such as Contes d'amour and domestic violence have attracted international attention. The artist lives and works in Sweden and Berlin. You have 10 minutes.
And thanks for the invitation. I will talk about Me Too and patriarchal monsters of our times. But for you to understand me a little bit better, I will start by giving you a brief introduction to my background. I'm 52 years old. I grew up in a very small village called Niskampää in the very north of Sweden, just to the border of Finland, with about 60 inhabitants, most of them my family and relatives. So I grew up in a very patriarchal society and family. My grandfather was the strong patriarch that everyone looked up to, and he was also the boss of the small family company that had a few tractors and a truck. And in one way or the other, Everyone in the family was working for him. And to say it shortly, my grandfather was a patriarchal asshole who treated my grandmother like shit her whole life, as well anyone in the family that did not come up to his standards of how to act or live your life. So my artistic practice as an artist is a way of dealing with that upbringing, often through a violent confrontation with heteronormative family structures, patriarchal violence, and the ideology of romantic love. So when Me Too movement started to gain momentum in 2017-18, I was so excited to see all these masks fall off and all these stinky, toxic rooms finally being ventilated. And like with all revolutions, they come with a price. But I tell you all, that price is worth paying. I will come back to that. But first, let's take us back to 2017-18, when the first and biggest famous Me Too cases were revealed in front of our eyes, and how that was dealt with. Not only by the Me Too men, all of them, of course, denied everything, but by the theater institutions, festival curators, and producers who for decades had fed these Me Too men's egos by accepting their sexist and patriarchal behavior and inviting them year after year to present their work. In this way, they normalized their behavior. I'm not saying that everyone knew all the details, how bad it really was, but they actively chose to turn a blind eye to the reality. As long as they were looked upon as radical and genius artists, and in the end had a very big, often bourgeois audience, they could just continue. The art industry's lack of really take for how the Me Too men could act freely inside festivals and theaters for decades was something I addressed here at Wiener Festwochen in 2019 when I did the performance about Me Too called 3 Episodes of Life. Well, they dealt with it in one way. They threw the Me Too men out of their theaters and festivals and tried to wash their hands clean as fast as possible because, of course, they knew they had dirty fingers. And don't misunderstand me here. I was happy to see them leave. But what they did was just taking care of a symptom, not the cause of the symptom. And that's the reason why we have ended up in the situation now where we are 7-8 years later, when the Me Too men slowly starts to return. This time not as perpetrators, but as victims. They disappeared from the scene with fear of the power of the Me Too movement, and now they are returning with hate and aggression. They are victims. They don't feel shame anymore, and they are suing back. This is what happens when only the symptom is removed and not the cause of the symptom. The patriarchal power structures in the art world, as well as all over our society, is so old, so strong, and so spread out all over that it will find new ways to strike back if they are not destroyed from the inside. And this time, it has found new ways to mobilize and find weak points in their enemy. And now they are striking back with a force that if we don't keep our eyes open, I can tell you, the Me Too movement will be looked upon just like a bump in the road for the patriarchy in the future. And what is happening now? Well, they found their weak point, and now all the focus is shifted to the more questionable Me Too cases that has come along with this revolution, they say. Look, they went too far. I'm also a victim, they're saying. Why does this gray zone Me Too cases still happen? And even if there are very few, they get more and more attention. And they are taking away the focus from the core of the Me Too movement. Well, the answer is again to be found in the unwillingness from the theater and art world to take the responsibility for their participation in underlying patriarchal structures from the beginning. Now they are so paranoid and afraid of losing their privileged positions that the art world doesn't dare to take a stand in any Me Too case where there is any doubt. They just want to get rid of any Me Too related problem. And this creates more and more of these gray zone Me Too cases. So now they are feeding the patriarchal monster again. So what do I think about these gray zone Me Too cases that are now reported about everywhere? Well, I think it's important to keep two thoughts in the head at the same time. I for sure think it's important that this revolution does not create more male counter martyrs unnecessary. But at the same time, as I started to say, every revolution has its price. And to be honest, it is privileged men in high position that maybe has lost their jobs because of this quite small number of gray zone Me Too cases that has been in the media lately. But I tell you, they will survive. What is that compared to all the thousands of women that for decades did not even get their career started or destroyed just because they did not want to suck someone director's dick or pose naked in front of a camera in a hotel room with their director? So if you ask me,
You have 1 minute.
that's worth the price. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Markus. Ich bitte das zweite Eröffnungsstatement von Andrea Schur.
Now, Andrea Jurian, I would like to ask you to take the floor. Andrea Jurian is a cultural journalist and author, and from 2008 to 2020, she was head of the culture department at the daily newspaper The Standard and has since been editor-in-chief of the Jewish magazine Nu. And before that, she was a moderator and a presenter for Kunststücke, Zipkultur, and the program Kulturzeit. You have 10 minutes. Well, I'm not really sure whether I'm going to be able to finish in 10 minutes. Well, 10 minutes is long and short at the same time. Now, the question is, how should we deal with the work of criminal artists? Should we ban them or distinguish between the person, the artist, and the work? I'm convinced that not only good people produce good art, as history has abundantly shown us. Now, today, the sexual assault of children, molesting children, has been mentioned a couple of times. So abuse, I don't know, that is a term that at least in German is a bit tricky. Now, for a long time, I've been convinced that the color of one's skin, ethnicity, national affiliation, religious beliefs, etc., gender should not play a role in our coexistence and not in art, but unfortunately, the contrary is true. Verbal neophytes such as cancel culture, wokeness, political correctness, critical whiteness, safe spaces, trigger warnings, cultural appropriation, Me Too, etc., actually displace the taboos in art and culture, and people are easily offended. And there are so many facets, really, of the identity debates that have fragmented society. Now, the freedom of art used to be a high good, a high commodity, and people wanted to fight for that. Now it's, let us say, virtual barricades. And sometimes pictures are taken down and movies are banned and books even burned. And all of that happened during National Socialism and in other totalitarian regimes. And later on, we saw attacks on actionists, for example, Thomas Bernhard's place were attacked, etc. But the numerous facets, really, that we saw have, as I said before, fragmented society into small and tiny groupings of belonging, and also into ethnic, religious, political, and sexual identities. Unfortunately, I would like to add, the protest often comes from the right, from the far right, but recently it has also been coming from woke people, and it has a fascist overtone, even if it comes from the left. It goes without saying that there is a need to clarify all of the confusion of LGBTQIA+ terms. That is why Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, for example, published an online glossary. They said being gay means a man is attracted to another man. However, being lesbian was explained as a non-man attracted to non-men. So apparently, man is not a toxic term, but woman is. Now, Martina Navratilova posted some refreshing comments, and she said, "What the fuck?" Now, a storm of indignation from heterosexual and homosexual women has thankfully blown this glossary off the website, and maybe it would be enough if we treated each other, let us say, with respect in the old-fashioned way, without the need to use gender-neutral language. So I think we could do that as long as we respect each other. We should. Well, the Austrian actor, for example, Florian Teichtmeister, had little respect for other people. He siphoned off tens of thousands of files with images of sexually abused children and young people from the darknet. He edited them and added pedo-sadist texts. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison in September 2023, and he was committed to a forensic therapeutic center. So there were the first rumors about his sick addiction to collecting those dirty pictures, and that came into light in 2020, 2021, and the award-winning film Corsage about Empress Elizabeth had already been shot, and Teichtmeister, of course, had a role in this. And the film actually made it onto the shortlist for the Oscar for the Best Foreign Language Picture, and she decided not to withdraw her movie. And I think she was correct in doing that, because it is a great movie. It's actually a feminist historical drama, and it won many prizes. So we should really be careful as to who to punish. And Teichtmeister maybe, or allegedly, is not a good human being, but he was a good actor, really, and most likely he will not get any more engagements for the rest of his life. But it is rather hypocritical that he will be completely eliminated from the world of film and television, and in addition, all of his other colleagues who participated in the movie, who could not have known of his, let us say, behavior, would also be punished along the way, and they would lose out on income, and also other crew members, because they would not be able to participate in royalties. So films should be shown, those Teichtmeister movies, but probably they should be contextualized, which is to say, maybe in the opening or closing credits, his behavior could be outlined. Hollywood star Kevin Spacey was mentioned before. He was accused of sexually harassing an underage boy. And only a few days passed before his part in a movie that had already been shot was cut out. And courts in New York and also in London found him innocent of all the charges. But on social media, he's still seen as a gay child abuser. And apart from small roles, his career is certainly on hold. So yes, Me Too has raised awareness. Assault, power abuse, abuse in general, dirty jokes and insinuating innuendos no longer remain without consequences, which is positive. But of course, Me Too is also hypocritical at times, with all sorts, let us say, of old scores bubbling to the surface in the pseudo-morality behavior. I remember what happened in the Middle Ages, and now there is very often no presumption of innocence like in a proper court of law, and a proper defense is almost impossible. Some people are broken by this, like the Swedish theater director Benny Fredriksson, who took his own life in March 2018 after unproven accusations. It was, as one of his colleagues recalled, a hunt, and the media were just looking for a scandal. U.S. producer and agent Jill Messick also committed suicide after facing accusations, and it was said that she had failed to adequately protect actresses from Harvey Weinstein's sick advances. And the Hollywood mogul's career has quite rightly gone down the drain, but the films, the movies he produced can still be seen, which is also correct in my opinion. And the films are not bad, the producer is bad. And Weinstein was the first prominent Me Too case. More than 100 women accused him of sexual assault and rape, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And 2 years ago, the New York Court of Appeals overturned the sentence. Now the case is back in court, and Weinstein has been convicted again. You have 1 more minute. Way too short, she's saying. Okay. And the fact that Asia Argento, the Me Too initiator, admitted to having consensual sex with Weinstein for years after his sexual assault. And also, anyone who repeatedly goes to a film producer's suite instead of the nearest police station after a sexual assault should have their image as an emancipated woman scrutinized. And also, she responded to accusations of abuse made against her by a young actor by refusing everything. And also, when there was no way out, she admitted to everything. So, but there are other cases. We can go back and have a look at some painters, for example, Benvenuto Cellini, Michelangelo, Merisi da Caravaggio. Cellini, for example, was accused of 3 murderies and the abuse of underage boys. And also, of course, Jean Verbeck. So, Caravaggio, for example, was also a thug. And we could also mention Carl André, or the Cuban-American artist Ana Mendieta. She was pushed actually out of the window by her husband, Carl André. And also, we could talk about the French poet François Villon. He beat a priest to death in the 15th century. I could give numerous examples. For example, a Perry, British crime writer, only escaped the death penalty because she was still a minor when she and her best friend killed her mother. Paul Gauguin married a 13-year-old. Alice in Wonderland author Lewis Carroll took 3,000 photos of oftentimes naked children. Egon Schiele painted and is unmistakable a pendant for young girls. The architect Adolf Loos and the coffee house writer Beta Altenberg also had sex with minors. Apologies. I was just about to talk about Otto Mühl. So very briefly, just half a minute. It is okay, really, that Otto Mühl was convicted, but please feel free to have a look at his paintings, and it has nothing to do with his abuse. I've written down the rest. Thank you very much.
Darf nun Alexia Stuefer.
Now I would like Alexia Stuefer to give us her legal introduction to the legal aspects of the 3 upcoming cases and guide us along on this journey from a legal perspective. Thank you very much.
Das Thema.
The topic that the Free Republic of Vienna has asked us to examine on the second weekend of the Congress is entitled, as we've heard, Art and Abuse. The fact that these 2 terms can be pronounced in the same breath, that a Vienna Congress is even dedicated to them in this combination, is both tragic and necessary. Dealing with this subject immediately reveals that it is obviously something deeply human. After all, violence and assaults perpetrated against others have been part of humanity since time immemorial. The last 2 millennia, which have been subject to solid scientific scrutiny, also show that violence, including sexual violence, is an issue of socially constructed masculinity. And the violence and the wars of today, I ask, who is responsible? There's no need to pore over the scientific record to reveal the history of women, men, and children. Indeed, the image of humanity of Putin, Trump, and co, Hamas, the Taliban, they show us who they are on a daily basis. See, for example, the current U.S. administration, which is marked by arrogance, is led by a man convicted of forging documents. He used counterfeit documents to conceal hush money for an actress and a filmmaker from the porn industry. It is widely believed that the criminal proceedings even benefited him politically. It's really not a mystery why someone who says, quote, grab him by the pussy, is still elected president by both men and women, but definitely more than men. But lo and behold, in fact, the Free Republic of Vienna has given us 3 cases to discuss, each of which also concern men. Another common denominator besides their gender is their profession. They were artists or are artists. The person in question is Otto Mühl, who died in 2007. According to the publicly accessible sources, Otto Mühl was an Austrian action artist and a protagonist of Viennese actionism. This was a modern art movement in which a group of Viennese artists in the 1960s took up the concept of happenings and the Fluxus art movement in the US and implemented these in a very provocative way. Mühl was sentenced to 7 years in prison in 1991 for, amongst other things, as it was common at the time, sexual relations with minors, abuse of a relationship of authority, rape, providing false testimony, unauthorized distribution of narcotics. These were committed at the main location of the Friedrichshof commune, which he founded and led, while he continued to produce art. Florian Teichtmeister, born in 1979, is an award-winning Austrian film and stage actor. and he was a member of the prestigious Burgtheater ensemble until he was dismissed on the 13th of January 2023 for possession of images of child abuse. Consequently, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison on the 5th of September 2023 and committed to a forensic therapeutic center.
Beides
Both
bedingt und das
are subject to a probationary period of 5 years and are subject to judicial supervision. Born in 1963, Till Lindemann is a German singer and songwriter, lead singer of the band Rammstein, and he's also a solo artist. In 2023, public and, except in one case, unspecified allegations that he had made unwanted sexual advances were raised against him, in each case, without consequences. None of the women decided to make a statement to the relevant authorities,
juristisch jede weitere
which is why any further discussion in this regard is superfluous.
Gemeinsamkeit der Kausen ist nicht
Another aspect that the cases have in common is
das Ergebnis,
the professional activity of the perpetrators,
das im Vergleich
which, unlike with most other professions, is viewed through a different lens,
wahrgenommen wird, die Schaffung von
namely the creation of art. You've guessed it.
die Freie Republik
It's already been said here. The Free Republic of Vienna will be discussing the difficult question of the separation, or rather, the relationship between the person, in this case, the artist or artists,
und den von ihnen
and the works they create. In other words,
diskutieren lassen.
their art.
Anlass, auch das haben
The
wir
reason for this is their proximity to abuse, to criminal abuse, and to acts punishable by law. Which is our interim conclusion, even their art is not outside the realm of judgment.
kein Problem.
A discussion about art, the jurist in me immediately says it's not an issue, no problem. But we are immediately faced with the question, what is art? There is no definition of art at the ready.
Moderne, ja,
Probably one of the most difficult questions of modernity, indeed of human history. It remains admittedly unresolved. And what is law? Same.
sagen lässt sich nach dem heutigen
As things stand today, it is safe to say, from a legal perspective, that art has an important place in Austria's constitution. It is one of the most important pillars of the Austrian constitutional state.
als Teil der Verfassung ist sie maßgeblich und
As part of the constitution, art is a decisive component and is formative for the fundamental liberal principles inherent in it. This is originally understood as the guarantee of freedom from the state. In other words, the legal protection of freedom from state interference in the practice of art
Produktion, Kunst, Schaffung, Kunstausübung, aber auch deren
and the production of art, but also in its mediation, exhibition, and above all, its teaching. So this space here, at this moment,
besondere
and especially thanks to you for coming and participating, this space here is protected by the Constitution because art is taking place here. So you can see law can indeed be exciting. So this brings us to the legal situation.
sagt der schon erwähnte Artikel 17a des Staatsgrundgesetzes
Artistic creation, the communication of art, and teaching, its teaching are free according to Article 17 of the Constitution from 1982.
verfassungsrechtlich verankert hat. Das Gesetz lautet wie folgt: Das künstlerische Schaffen
As I've said,
von Kunst und ihre Lehre
artistic creation, the communication of art, and its teaching are free. Article 10
bezieht die Kunstfreiheit
of the ECHR on freedom of expression includes artistic freedom in its scope of protection. Both legal norms have constitutional status. In other words, the highest level under Austrian law. The European Union also protects the freedom of art under law. Article 13 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union reads, art and research are free. Academic freedom is upheld.
Sogleich folgt
For
aber,
its part, the Charter
darf nicht alles,
also enjoys preeminent status under European law. However, we must follow up with,
Juristin zu sagen,
art is not allowed to do anything and everything. And I say that as a jurist. State infringement on the freedom of art is only justified if and only if it is provided for by law and is deemed unavoidable in a democratic society, i.e., if it is absolutely necessary. Preventive interventions, for example, criminal laws or repressive interventions, for example, the confiscation of a work of art,
von Werken. In jedem Einzelfall muss der Staat
may be considered, but in each individual case, state intervention must be therefore particularly justified. This requires a legal basis, a legitimate objective,
und das gelindeste Mittel zu
and it must use the least intrusive means possible of achieving its objective. In other words, it must be necessary and proportionate. But what is art? A smart piece of Austrian legislation adopted in 1980 recognized the importance of this question, which is difficult to put into words, and wisely decided not to define the term in codified law.
ein Einfluss wäre. Auch der Europäische Gerichtshof für Menschenrechte
The
prägt
European Court of Human Rights also coined a so-called
offenen Kunst.
open concept of art in its established case law. At this point, I must once again emphasize, particularly for understanding for the next several days,
Das Verhältnis von Individuen und Kollektiven und dem Staat regelt. Ja? Aber grundsätzlich
that constitutional rights regulate the relationship between state and individuals, collectives and legal entities, but not between private individuals. Between them, private law primarily applies, depending on the area,
Recht auf
and fundamental rights only obtain if the Constitution stipulates this as such. For example, a prohibition on discrimination due to gender in labor relations,
gelten die Grundrechte
but otherwise, fundamental rights
und privaten Personen.
and obtain between the state and private persons.
Zwei Grundrechte zu nennen,
There are other fundamental rights, too, that must be mentioned that are very important, namely the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, which we've already touched on, and of course, the protection of privacy. These are also enshrined in the Constitution, namely in Article 6, Para 2, and Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, as well as in Article 48 and Article 7 of the Charter of Human Fundamental Rights.
gegen staatliche
These are also directed against state interference.
Beide Rechte aber enthalten, und
Both rights, however,
das etwas Besonderes
and this is something very important and very special for us to understand, they also contain a so-called guarantee obligation towards the state. In other words, the Constitution obliges the state, the parliament, the judiciary, and the executive branch to create legal and, as a result, the factual conditions to ensure the protection of fundamental rights.
Rechtes vor, dass die
Accordingly, the provisions of media law, for example, stipulate that reporting must not violate the presumption of innocence or the right to privacy.
es ist einsehbar, auch das
It is quite clear, and this is something that we've heard a great deal today, that a great deal has changed in these areas over the past century, particularly since the digital revolution.
Betreiberinnen von Social Media Accounts
Of course, the operators of social media accounts are also considered media owners,
Rechte und auch Pflichten.
and they must shoulder all of the concomitant rights and obligations inherent in that role. So much for a brief introduction to the world of law. Now let us move on to the questions put to us by the Free Republic of Vienna, which will be discussed at 3 upcoming sessions. The first
Titel oder
session is entitled
erste Sitzung trägt folgenden Titel: Kunstkanon und
Art Canon and Complicity, Müll,
das Museum.
Friedrichshof and the Museum. The questions.
Kunst
Should Otto Müll's art be struck from the artistic canon and therefore no longer be exhibited in large-scale art presentations, especially in public museums?
Zweitens,
Secondly,
Forderung.
is the demand that certain images no longer be shown at all a disenfranchisement of the public or even an encroachment on artistic freedom? Thirdly, are most pictures, such as the so-called ash pictures, are they art or are they evidence of abuse?
Die sogenannte Kunstkommune
4. Was the so-called art commune at Friedrichshof already a cult at the time of its creation?
Österreich
And did therefore the Austrian state fail to meet its obligation towards the children and young people at Friedrichshof? Are the victims of Otto Müll therefore entitled to state compensation payments? The topic of the second session is institutional responsibility
des Schweigens
and the culture of silence, the Teichtmeister case.
hält die Freie Republik Wien
The Free Republic of Vienna has put the following questions to the jury. First of all, is it correct that the Austrian broadcasting system has taken productions of Fräulein Teichtmeister out of its programming and no longer broadcasts them? Secondly, are the public verbal attacks on Teichtmeister disproportionate, and are they, for that reason, tantamount to an incitement of hate to hatred? Thirdly, did the Vienna Burgtheater as an art institution react correctly in the Teichtmeister case? Fourthly, does the state need to set up further preventive measures and support structures for the film, TV, and theater industry to protect actors from assault, violence, and abuse in the workplace? And finally, the title of the last session, of the third session, the Rammstein case, Me Too in the music industry, prejudice and the lyrical first-person narrator. The key questions for the session are as follows. Is Till Lindemann's artistic work a call for sexualized violence against women and a glorification of rape culture? Second, was Till Lindemann permanently and even unfairly damaged because of unproven statements? Thirdly, did the Row Zero system obviously establish situations that favor unwanted sexual advances? Is it ethically justifiable for organizers to stage large concerts with Till Lindemann? Fourthly, in general, does the personal protection of prominent defendants predominate in the reporting of suspicions? Should, therefore, the protection of victims be strengthened as a result? So, those were the questions. In the course of our investigation, the Congress, again, is based on the model of the Agon, the peaceful exchange of arguments, views, and ideas that is thought to have existed in antiquity. During the interviews with the respondents, the facts of the case will be visible and tangible in all of their opposing facets, right before your very eyes and ears. The Congress chair and vice chair once again has invited Antigone, an ancient activist intellectual, to attend this weekend's event in spirit. She taught us to question the prevailing order in the face of violence that could not be tamed. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Alexia Stoifer for your elaborate remarks. Now, on Sunday, the jury will then comment on this in great detail. We will now continue with the opening statements. I would now like to ask Yasmin Matuk for the third opening statement. You have 10 minutes. Yasmin Matuk is an Austrian journalist, a presenter, and an actress with Egyptian roots. She currently works as a social media editor and video journalist at the online magazine Moment, where she is particularly responsible for TikTok content.
Sehr geehrte Anwesende, liebe Jury,
Guests, jury, dear audience, I struggled a lot as to whether I wanted to speak here today because I'm sharing a stage here with people who don't deserve to be on a stage. The Vienna Congress puts my position, which is based on justice, human rights, facts and figures, on the same level of legitimacy as the position of people who protect criminals and trample all over the suffering of victims. And this is being advertised to all of us as a discussion that promotes democracy, which it is not. I'm here today not to please you. I'm standing here today to finally say what far too few people dare to say, a truth that is uncomfortable because it makes us all responsible. I'm standing here because I love art, because I know how it can save us, how it can comfort us, shake us up, change us. But I'm also here because I know how it can destroy others and how it is used to destroy others. Can you separate art from the artist? Is that what you want to discuss? Is that why you're here today? This debate is a disgrace. What we're having here is not an open discussion. It is a symptom of a deeply misogynistic normality. We pretend that we're dealing with trade-offs, difficult ethical questions, as if everything here is in a gray area open to discussion. But it is not like that. Things are not gray. They are clear. We know that violence happens every day, especially in art. We know who the perpetrators are, almost always men. We know that those affected have hardly any protection, and still, yet we are here discussing as to whether we can separate art from the artists, as if that were a clever, nuanced question. Really? What are we actually doing here? Today we're talking about artistic freedom, but whose freedom do we mean? Who's allowed to feel free? Who's allowed to say anything, show anything, do anything? And who has to remain silent, cower, justify themselves? If we're honest, artistic freedom in this country primarily protects the freedom of those who've always been in power, the freedom of those who get the stage, who get prizes, funding, attention, and applause no matter what they do. The freedom of those who can get away with everything because they know that they can, because we show them, because society shows them that they can actually get away with everything. The freedom of white, male, successful perpetrators. Now, what kind of freedom is that if it only applies to some? Yes, right. It is no freedom. When men use the power that we as a society and the culture sector give to them to abuse people, and that does not change their reputation or impact it at all, then that is no longer freedom, it's no longer art. That is absolute power. And power that cannot be questioned is not freedom, it is domination, really, if you will. And all those who defend this power and come up with excuses for the perpetrators, who even glorify them or remain silent, become accomplices. With your complicity, you're not only tolerating structural violence, you're covering it up. We love art because it breaks taboos, provokes, challenges us. So do I. I love art that hurts. Art that negotiates power and guilt, but the greatest danger to art is not criticism. Criticism is necessary. It keeps art alive, accessible, and honest. The actual danger is when the boundary between freedom and human rights is renegotiated and redefined. And women's rights are human rights. There is no doubt about that. And the right to physical and psychological integrity is just as fundamental a right. This is not a moral extra, but it is enshrined in the law. In Article 7 of the Austrian Federal Constitution, which guarantees the equal treatment of all people, and also in Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which protects the right to privacy and integrity. If human rights do not apply to one person, then they no longer apply to anyone. If violence exerted by the patriarchy is tolerated in the name of art and also accepted by society, then that is the real danger for art. And the fact that somebody only needs to be applauded loudly enough and suddenly every boundary is shifted and blurred when fame outweighs responsibility, that is not artistic freedom, that is freedom of the offender. And there are even standing ovations, and that, my friends, is something we are and have to protect. That is something we have to collectively defend ourselves against in the name and on behalf of those who have been broken by the powers. And then somebody says, but he hasn't been convicted. We don't need a court decision to take a moral stand. We end friendships, right? Relationships, work relationships, because our values no longer match. We do this all the time in our personal lives, but in the public sphere, in the culture sector, we suddenly expect a judgment or wait for a judgment before we take a stand. Why? Simply because we lack the courage to do so, because we are afraid, because we don't want to admit to ourselves that we are part of a system that protects perpetrators. What is legal has never been the yardstick for justice. There were times when it was legal to beat women, when child labor was legal, and it was legal to deport and kill people just because they were Jewish. That was the law at a time, but it was never justice. The law changes. Conscience does not. Laws always lag behind humanity. They are the absolute minimum. But we should, of course, never stop and be satisfied with the absolute minimum. Why do we find it so difficult to question people in a position of power? Because it hurts to admit that we have admired somebody who has abused their power. And that's exactly where responsibility starts, not just for him, but for everyone, actually, who looked the other way. Art is not an alibi. Being a fan doesn't mean being blind. If you say, well, I still want to listen to that song, then at least you should be honest and say, well, let us say my well-being is more important than somebody else's pain or my joy. They call out cancel culture, and I would like to ask them, where is it? Who would actually need it? Otto Mühl was convicted of child abuse, and his paintings still hang in museums today. Florian Techtmeister had tens of thousands of images of violence against children on his devices and was applauded to the end. Women have reported assaults on Till Lindemann. The judiciary drops the case. The music industry carries on as if nothing had happened. Because they bring money, because their market value counts more than the word of people concerned. Comedians fill halls after accusations have been put forward. Bands make millions with abusive lyrics, and the US is led by a sex offender as a president. Who gets the stage and who's never got the stage? Because it was precisely men like him who suppressed it. Nobody has a right to applause. A performance is not a fundamental right. It's a leap of faith. And anyone who abuses this trust can lose it. True artistic freedom begins when we're no longer afraid to look, where we can say, yes, it hurts, it's painful, but that's no reason to carry on as before. If we can't stand this truth, then perhaps what we called art has never been free, but just patriarchal. And yes, you have 1 minute. And yes, you have to admit yourself, I've made someone great who has made others small. I kept quiet so that I could continue to belong. I was part of a system that silenced those affected. This is where change begins. And anyone sitting here today who does not feel addressed has not understood the problem. Artistic freedom is not in danger, but the balance of power is. And that is a good thing. Because anybody who claims that Me Too is endangering art is speaking out against victims of sexualized violence. Destruction has always been here. And it's called male violence. Me Too is the answer to it. We need to redistribute the stages. For long enough, the spaces were only accessible to one specific group of people. While these people abused their powers, the victims had to withdraw out of fear, out of shame, because nobody listened to them. Nobody believed them. If we frame the voices of those affected as a threat to artistic freedom, then we're not protecting art, we're protecting perpetrators. That is not freedom, that is betrayal. Me Too is not a threat. It is solidarity, it's loyalty. Dear listeners, while you sit back comfortably in your seats at the Vienna Congresses and hear so many more words on the stage, don't forget that it would only take 2 words. Believe the victims.
Vielen Dank. Vielen Dank, Jasmin.
Thank you very much. Jasmin, thank you.
Dolores Schmiedinger.
I would now like to ask Dolores Schmiedinger to come up to the lectern, please, to give your statement. Please come up. Yes, it's your turn.
Kabarettistin.
She is an Austrian actress, cabaret artist, a director, and author. She has been active in theater and film since the 1960s and is known for her political and social commitment.
Sie haben 10 Minuten.
You have 10 minutes, Dolores. Sorry, I just have one more thing I need to read. Sorry. She is a favorite with audiences, and she has delighted people for decades with her versatile stage presence. She has received many awards for her work.
Ich red laut.
I
Keine Sorge haben. Also ich möchte
have a loud voice. Don't worry about me.
schreienden Regisseuren.
I would like to talk about screaming directors.
Schauspielschule in den
When I was in acting school at the beginning of the 60s,
der Schauspielschule Graus und der alte
it was the Gross School, and Mr. Gross screamed all of us down. The teachers, the students, that's just the way he did things.
Da war noch die Kriegsgeneration und hat noch
Yes, of course, this was the generation that had experienced World War II, and he knew what Goebbels sound like. And he never really attacked me personally.
die Angst haben sie nicht gerochen bei mir.
Because they never smelled my fear. I actually had an okay time of it because I was rather confident. In any case, this continued at the Volkstheater, where I had an engagement 3 years later.
Was Mode mit
It was very in at the time to scream at people.
gehalten.
Any director who thought he was a big deal screamed at the actors, and the other ones just weren't taken very seriously.
In seinem Fach
The true
Manker, der Intendant,
master was Gustav Mank. He was the artistic director at the time. He was the father of Paulus Manke, who was rather infamous. He destroyed people's careers. He was very cynical. He was a sadist through and through.
also ich habe meine erste Rolle war ein Klassiker von
My first role was in a Gridparzer play,
und ich habe auf einer Probe meinen
and in a rehearsal,
da runter
I was performing my monologue, and Manka said, Schmiediger, take your finger out of your ass. This was his direction to me. It was the only one that I got from him.
sogar Amphetamine genommen, weil wir uns so
We took amphetamines, we took speed, because we were so afraid of him as a director.
Also 2 Jahre später
So 2 years later, or 1 year later, I'm not sure, nobody dared yell at me because they realized that I was talented.
ja, bin halt sehr bald
And very
sehr geworden in
soon thereafter, I gained a great deal of popularity in Vienna.
von wegen sexuellen Missbrauch
So, speaking of sexual assault,
mitreden.
I really can't contribute anything.
Missbrauch durch meinen Vater mit 4 Jahren so eine Hypersexualität aufgerissen habe.
Because I was hypersexualized due to abuse by my father when I was just 4 years old.
Das ist der alte Ausdruck. Und die Männer haben sich eher vor mir gefürchtet.
Men were actually quite afraid of me.
Und das kastriert natürlich.
I would ask them perhaps to go to bed, and they thought they would be castrated.
Da ist schon einiges los gewesen.
So
Besetzungscouch. Aber
there was a great deal happening on the casting couch, but we didn't talk about it at the time. Everybody was so ashamed.
das war so ein Tabu.
This was such a taboo at the time.
Nichts gesagt.
Nobody dared talk about it.
Ja, und im Volkstheater ist es mir dann sehr gut gegangen. Und dann
I had quite a good time of it at the Volkstheater. Then I switched to the Theater in der Rosostadt. And then for the first time, I came into contact with
den Lieblingen
actors there who were
Wiener und der Österreicher,
audience favorites in Vienna.
wie ich sie
They were the big shots, so to speak, in Vienna in the theater scene. For example, Fritz Mulia was one big culprit. Many of you may be familiar with him. He has been dead quite a while. He was a fan fave. Everybody thought he was a sweetie, but he was actually a sleazeball. He was a heel. He was a jerk. I was there where he yelled at a 12-year-old child who was in tears. And then out in the courtyard, this was at the Wilhelminenberg Palace, because he knew that my husband at the time was a Freemason, so he approached me full of humanism, and he said, "Wonderful, this is a palace. This was built by the Freemasons." And he had tears in his eyes. It was bizarre, to say the least.
Ich muss mich kurz fassen.
I know I have to be very brief. 4 minutes. You still have 4 minutes. Oh, dear. Well, I have all kinds of funny stories to share. I guess I'll have to skip over them. And then there was Otto Schenk. Everybody loved him. And yesterday there was an event for his 95th birthday. Of course, he was not around to experience and celebrate that. Everybody thought he was such a dear man. He was not nice. He was not wonderful. He was an incorrigible 14-year-old.
Wie man in Wien sagt, hat aus dem Stand einen Wutausbruch.
He would have a temper tantrum on the spot, and he even got physical with us. The stage whisperer, who was absolutely a big fan, and she was a big masochist, I have to say, he beat her. If he couldn't remember his lines, then he would physically beat her, and she took it from him. She was quite happy to. And then we had a colleague as well who had large breasts. Otti didn't like to see large breasts on women. And in rehearsal, he had already downed quite a bit of cognac, and he kept hitting her breasts. So the fan favorite Otto Schenk was a disgusting creep. And everybody said, well, then he was well behaved and sweet again, and everybody said, "Oh, he's such a sweetie. What a fantastic guy." I've even seen this with sadists who do their worst. And then all of a sudden, at the drop of a hat, they are calm and sweet. Everybody says, "Oh, he doesn't mean it that way." And in conclusion, I do have to share this story with you. I have to get this off my chest. This is the last story I want to share with you about power.
In den Kammerspielen von der Josefstadt.
In the Josefstadt Theater, we acted in a play. It was called Othello darf nicht platzen. It was about Othello. And this had a very long running time. Otto Schenk and Erwin Steinhauer had the main roles. They were the dominant actors. And Steinhauer, I have to say, oh my goodness, he was not a nice guy, not at all. In any case, he was in one of the main roles in the play. And Gideon Singer at the time, he was the sweetest, most gentle person in the world. He was a bit older. He had played in La Mancha on Broadway, Man of La Mancha. And Otto Schenk and Erwin Steinhauer were eaten up with jealousy. But he was such a sweetie. He had victim written across his forehead. I will never forget this. And this was the worst case of abuse that I myself witnessed. This was
Sein Sohn war in Israel.
Terrible misuse. Gideon his son was an attorney in Israel. And in 1993, there was an agreement reached, the Oslo Accords, and Gideon's son, the attorney, was a participant, is instrumental in bringing those accords about. His name was Yo. And this was a peace agreement between the PLO and Israel at the time. And Gideon was terribly proud of his son. And on that day, he was the absolute number one. And these two big shots, they couldn't take that somebody else had the spotlight, and they tortured him, they bullied him, like on the playground, until he cried. And I think that just says it all. And that brings me to the end of my statement. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of the speakers today. Thank you much to the jury. Thank you much to everybody participating in this Congress. The opening session of the Second Vienna Congress is hereby closed. I hope to see you back here tomorrow at 11 a.m. We will be examining our first case, the art canon and complicity, Mühl, Friedrichshof, and the museum. We would ask you to please be here on time. The meeting is hereby closed.
Steht auf, ihr Töchter und ihr Söhne. Steht auf, für aller Menschen Recht. Lasst den Faschisten keine Chance und hört den Anfängern wie Felsen fest. Steht auf, wir Kapellen.